An animation plays with words coming in from different directions reading National Council on Independent Living Oral History Project. Interview with founding member and pioneer Colleen Starkloff.
I'm Colleen Starkloff, and I'm a longstanding participant in the disability rights movement. My late husband, Max Starkloff, from St. Louis, was one of the leaders in disability rights during the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s, actually, for more than 40 years. When I met him, I fell in love with him just like that. There was really a lot in his eyes and his smile. And what happened was we began talking, we began dating, we began spending, after work at night, I'd go down to his nursing home room and just talk to him. And I began to see disability through Max's lens. And I realized pretty quickly that there were an awful lot of people working in physical therapy, but it didn't seem like there were enough people who are working on the rights of people with disabilities to not have to live in nursing homes, to live emancipated lives in the community, to be married, to have families, to do everything that you would expect growing up in this country. And so after we dated for 2 years and we got married October 4th, 1975, and then I worked at the nursing home for another year and then quit my job because Max was building a nonprofit organization he had started before I met him called Paraquad in St. Louis. And it was devoted to creating housing for people with disabilities so that they wouldn't have to live in nursing homes, that they could live in fully accessible housing and also have access to attendant services. It's all in the book, Max Starkloff and the Fight for Disability Rights. A shameless plug for the book. My relationship with Max really opened my eyes to something that I could really pledge my life to and stand with Max. And I learned from him. He was my mentor. But then we very quickly met Judy Heumann and Charlie Carr and Marco Bristow and some amazing, amazing people who had visions for a different life for people with disabilities, not only in the United States, but around the world. And so we got involved and Max and I really co-founded Paraquad as an independent living center. And after we worked with our colleagues around the nation, Lex Frieden, and Jenny Laurie in St. Louis, and many wonderful thought leaders, Paraquad was one of the first 10 federally funded independent living centers. So Max and I founded Paraquad, or you could say we co-founded, refounded Paraquad as an independent living center. And it became, when we were there, one of the largest independent living centers, not only in the country, but in the world. During the process of creating the regulations that would provide funding under the Rehabilitation Services Administration for independent living, we were constantly meeting at the Holiday Inn on C Street in Washington, D.C. And so that's where we would come together with Ed Roberts and Charlie Carr or Judy Heumann, people from around the country who were very interested in making sure that independent living was funded, because at that time, California already had 26 state-funded independent living centers. And Ed Roberts and Judy Heumann were very much entrenched in this whole effort. By that time, they were with the World Institute on Disability. But it was important to make sure that there was federal funding to give life to independent living centers around the country. So Max and I were getting up one morning at the Holiday Inn C Street, and I think this was probably 1980, maybe. Here's what happened. The first 10, when we got our funding in 79 from the Title VII funding, Max and I, Max really, but was our idea. Max reached out to Marga Bristow in Chicago with Access Living. She was starting a center there also one of the first 10 federally funded. And then we decided that we should bring all of the first 10 centers together to start talking about the regulations, how they'd be implemented, all this sort of stuff. But while Max and I were getting up at the Holiday Inn C Street while we were in the process of getting all this funding organized, we said, it's looking good that we're going to have this funding available. We should really start an organization of centers so that the centers could all come together and work together with each other. What are you doing? What's working? What's not? How are you implementing? And at that time, there weren't even regulations for what a center should look like. But what are you going to do? Some of the first centers were funded through Voc Rehab in their state. Voc Rehab applied for the funding and then gave it to a group in their state. We were directly funded by RSA. So there were different funding mechanisms. And we're like, if we're going to survive as an entity for independent living, we need to create an organization that supports us and that also becomes a really powerful advocacy voice for the policy decisions that really need to happen in Washington and in the states, so that the centers could activate policies in their states, but that we'd all collaborate on the ideas that would make independent living more robust and more successful and more sustainable. So anyway, Max and I were getting up and we said, we need to create this national organization and we can do it through the 10 centers. We got up and we went down to the hotel restaurant to have breakfast, and we called Marka and said, hey, Marka, meet us in the restaurant. We've got an idea. And so Marka did, and we were sitting there and she said, oh yeah, we should really do that. And then we said, let's get Lex. Lex was in the hotel too, because we're still meeting about the regulations around independent living. And so we'd already gotten the funding, but we were working on the regs. And so we got Lex and said, Lex, we got this idea. And Lex said, yeah, that's a great idea. Lex had already started the Center for Independent Living in Houston through the Texas Institute for Rehabilitation Research. So he was a key player. We wanted to make sure that he was on board with this idea. We reached out to the 10 original Title VII-funded centers and said, we'd like to invite you to come and have a meeting in St. Louis. And let's start mapping out all these issues, the regulations, the implementation of the regulations. There were people calling for IL standards. Maggie Shreve in Kansas City with Whole Person was calling for regulations and standardization. And we're like, I don't know if we really want to be too standardized, because this is something that needs to grow and not be hobbled by having to have only these certain standards that you should have as a center. But anyway, the 10 centers got together in St. Louis. It was in 1980, June or July of 1980. Our daughter, Megan, was an infant. She was there at the meeting in a little bassinet. But out of that meeting came the idea to meet on a regular basis, and different of the centers would host meetings. So the next one was Portland, Oregon. And I'm struggling to remember the name right off the bat, but the Portland, Oregon was one of the first 10 centers. And so they said, we'll hold the next meeting. And it was in the fall of 1980, in October, I believe, 1980. I can't remember all the rest of the meetings right off without looking at my Cliff's notes, but that got the ball rolling. It ended up that when we finally Max became a lead organizer of this effort, because we'd invited people to St. Louis to talk about it and to do it. And so Max was seen as a leader. He ended up, when we found it, I think the articles of incorporation for NCIL were probably in 82, but we met for several years together. And Judy Heumann, who wasn't with a center, she was with WID, but Judy was very active in this. Ed Roberts was very active in this. So there were a lot of key players that wanted to see this happen. That's really how NCIL got started. Max was when there were actually elections, Max was elected the founding president of NCIL. And then it just began to snowball in a very good way. We were really very pleased because many grassroots organizations wanted to, we reached out to the ones that we knew about, and we wanted them to become independent living centers and provide services so people in their states and their communities could live independent lives. But also it was important to that the centers be advocacy centers. There needed to be peer support. It was called peer counseling. There needed to be advocacy. There were 4 core services that were important. We wanted to ultimately figure out how we could raise money to establish an office, and we wanted the office to be in Washington, and that there should be a disabled person at the helm of that. It ended up being Anne Marie Huey as the first NCIL director in Washington, and that the centers would collaborate with what we've ultimately named the National Council on Independent Living and nicknamed it NCIL, and that we would have a board of directors for NCIL, that there would be members from centers from every state that had centers that would be regional reps. And there's 10 federal regions, so there were 10 regional reps. So we began to build a structure. It occurred over several years, and I don't actually recall exactly, but I would imagine somewhere Theo or some of the early leaders there's probably information there that escapes me right now. But we did begin to build a structure that could withstand frustrations and controversies. And we wanted the Silks to be involved because the Silks were part of the funding that came about as part of the whole structure for independent living. So we wanted everybody in the tent, and we didn't want anybody to be left out. We wanted it to be a forum for voices of people who had ideas to grow NCIL. We also wanted it to be, by having conferences every year, we wanted it to be a place to bring young people and people who'd been in the movement for a while together to share ideas, to continue to build leadership among younger people who were going to join this movement and who did join this movement. And so I think it was very successful.
A white card appears with the question, what was life like for people with disabilities at the time that NCIL was being formed?
Max was living in a nursing home because we didn't have an established attendant services system in this country to provide the personal assistance people need to live in the community. There were not curb cuts. Minneapolis apparently had some curb cuts. Some advocates up there had got some curb cuts. There was no 504 money that was mandating curb cuts if you were a federal recipient. There were no lifts on buses. The affordable housing that was accessible for people with disabilities was congregate facilities that most of whom provided attendance, which actually, as it turns out, was the same idea Max was going after until Ed Roberts told him that's not what you should do. Max went to see Ed in San Francisco and learned about what advocates there were trying to do so that people with disabilities could live in the community. Max said, my God, that makes so much sense. But so there was not the congregate housing that was existing that Max and I, when we created housing in St. Louis, which ended up being congregate housing because of the funding. We got funding from HUD, and it was the HUD 202 funds, and it only allowed for elderly and disabled people to live in the housing. But we didn't have the resources to do any better, and we thought we could change it, and we couldn't. So we sold it, and it was torn down. But in the process of that, we were looking around to see what's happening for housing in the country. And we found that most people, it was like parents groups that were coming together to provide housing for their kids who didn't want to live at home, but wanted to live in the community. And what we saw really was that with the facilities providing the attendant supports, what you were just really doing was creating little nursing homes. And what was important to us was that we create advocates who are empowered to change how people lived and to work with housing developers to create housing that was integrated in the community, that was not all what we called GIMP ghettos, only disabled people living there, but disabled and non-disabled living together, and that there would be different incomes, rent strategies that could enable people who didn't have many resources but wanted to live in the community and could get their attendance through Medicaid, could live there, but not be unable to afford the rent. So there were a lot of strategies and ideas going on at that time, but there really was not integrated housing in the community unless somebody had a lot of money because of their family or because they became disabled after they made a lot of money and they could afford to really pay their own way. And that reminds me that I should say that one of the linchpin issues upon which our movement was founded, was the idea of creating an attendant system through public policy that would stand on its own, that would enable people with disabilities who needed attendance to live outside of nursing homes in housing of their choice, whether it be an apartment or a house or, whatever, that they could hire and manage their own attendance. That did not exist when we started this. That's why Max was in a nursing home. So because of the experience of the disabled people that we all allied ourselves with throughout all across the country, we began to find each other. We got involved in political campaigns because we wanted legislators to come into the Congress who would understand our needs and help us when we'd reach out and say, what about a policy that would require all places to be accessible? What about requiring policy that landlords couldn't refuse to rent to disabled people? What about federal policy that would provide access to people on planes? So we got the Air Carriers Access Act. In 1988, we amended the Federal Housing Act so that landlords couldn't discriminate against disabled people in housing. Of course, there were some slimy things that were slid in there, meaning that disabled people had to pay for their own changes and then change them back. But guess what? Landlords don't change them back, but disabled people don't move out because there's not enough housing available still. So there were so many things that did not exist back then that now do exist because of 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, mandating that federal contractors have to make their places accessible, and then became implemented not until the 2000s, but that employers couldn't refuse to hire disabled people or discriminate against disabled people in employment, and that the railroads now have lifts on them. Over the road buses have lifts on them, and public buses in municipalities have lifts on them because they all get federal dollars. Then we said, well, you know what? That doesn't cover the waterfront. And Justin said, we need an Americans with Disabilities Act. So a bunch of us went to East Lansing, to the University of Michigan, East Lansing, and met with Justin and Yoshko and Ed and Judy and Max and me. And there were a whole bunch of us around the table, and the independent living centers came and started mapping out what would a policy look like that encompassed everybody who wasn't required by federal funding to become accessible and more open to people with disabilities. And that was the Americans with Disabilities Act. We were all at the table. We were all sharing ideas. We were all saying, yeah, we got to do this. And by golly, it happened in 2 years. And Justin and Yoshko traveled the country meeting with all the centers and getting us all rallied up and charged up and on the team. And we got it done. So I think the world is a better place now because of all the things we fought for. There's even been an effort in the Department of Transportation when Kelly Buckland was there after he left Nickel to create seats that you can wheel onto a plane through a jetway and lock down in your wheelchair. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with that under this administration because there's a lot of cutting and firings and furloughs and letting people go. and some projects could fall by the wayside. I think that the Americans with Disabilities Act would not have happened without Nickel and without ADAPT, without the centers all coming together in their communities. What we needed, what Nickel provides and continues to provide, is a grassroots advocacy network that can lobby their state legislatures, that can lobby the Congress. And, excuse me, we don't lobby, we educate. We bring about awareness, and we educate legislators about our needs and how policy can improve the quality of our lives. And that's a very important function of Nickel. And when we were fighting for the ADA, Nickel was a huge player in that. But so was the AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities. All of us came together, but Nickel had created a huge network that was funded. The independent living centers were funded to do advocacy. We wrote advocacy into the law that funds independent living centers. So that was a huge thing, a huge gain, I would say, to allowing us to have voice. And we have never been violent. We've always been present. We've always been outspoken. We've never, as far as I know, been mollycoddled by legislators or paid off. We've never been silenced or paid to be quiet. And so it was really a very, very strong coalition of organizations across the country. And yes, Nickel was a huge, important player in that, because you had people who had federal funding and could pay for their travel to Washington to coalesce with other groups to go visit their congressmen and senators. Justin Dart and Yoshiko Dart weren't Nickel. They didn't have a center. They were two advocates that were able to bring everybody together. And they really were the catalyst to get us all organized and say, that's a great idea. We should all line up and do that. And AAPD did exist. And so, but they had members who paid to the national, but they were all individual members. Nickel had organization members. That was very, very important. Max was the president of Nickel, which when he would go into Senator Jack Danforth's office and they told him that he could have 20 minutes with the senator, and he came out an hour and a half later, because I was waiting with our daughter in their office for an hour and a half. He took with him thousands and thousands of Americans with disabilities who he represented and was speaking for to the senator about why it's important for policy issues to come about that protect the rights, provide rights and protect rights of Americans with disabilities. Yes, Max very much felt empowered. There was definitely a feeling that not only did we have power, we were empowered to speak our truth. And we used our voices and we used our lives as people with disabilities to illustrate the points for why a man like Max Starkloff, who was quadriplegic and had lived in a nursing home, these were people with very significant disabilities who were powerful and were speaking and saying, we're not unusual. People like us can do like us, can have jobs, can be part of the workforce, can be part of the American economy, contributors to the American economy, but not if we're relegated to nursing homes where Medicaid comes in our door and we don't have taxpayers' dollars to go back into the Medicaid program. But if you don't provide attendance for us through Medicaid, we're stuck in nursing homes with a decreased quality of life and independence on somebody to provide us for food and getting out of bed every day. We want control over that. So, yeah, our language was empowerment language. And speaking truth to power, we were the power that was speaking the truth. And we did it respectfully through letters, through marches with hundreds and hundreds of disabled people carrying signs saying, our homes, not nursing homes. fix the system, not me. We had those kind of signs in our marches in St. Louis. So we were empowering other individuals with disabilities in our own localities to find their voice and to say, you don't have to live like this. You don't have to live at home with your parents for the rest of your lives. Now we have to stand up and fight that we don't lose all of the things that we've accomplished. We still have not established a strong attendant services system, and we got to do it. And we need to ally ourselves with the seniors, because seniors don't want to go to nursing homes, but that's where they end up if they don't have attendant services that come in their homes to support them. And if they're not on Medicaid, many of them can't afford it. Speak up, speak out, join us, fight with us. Let's get policies changed. But when I use fight, it means stand up, believe in the movement, and fight